America didn't win its independence with victory alone, it won it with debt. When the Revolutionary War ended, the new nation was drowning in IOUs, its economy fragile, its future uncertain. So how did a bankrupt republic transform into a functioning financial power? The answer lies in a bold, controversial plan that tied money to government in a way Americans had never seen before, laying the foundation for the entire U.S. financial system. The massive debt from the Revolutionary War forced the United States to confront financial chaos and build a centralized system. When the war ended in 1783, the new nation was politically independent but financially unstable, carrying tens of millions of dollars in debt owed to foreign allies like France and the Netherlands, as well as to American soldiers and citizens who had been paid in nearly worthless IOUs. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had no power to tax, which meant it had no reliable way to repay what it owed. States printed their own currencies, inflation ran high, and trust in the government's financial promises collapsed. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it threatened the survival of the country itself. Creditors doubted the U.S. would ever repay its debts, making future borrowing nearly impossible. This crisis created urgency among leaders like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who saw that political independence required financial credibility. The inability to manage war debt became one of the driving forces behind the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where a stronger federal government with the power to tax and regulate commerce was created. In other words, the burden of war debt didn't just shape economic policy, it reshaped the entire structure of American government, laying the foundation for a centralized financial system that could support a functioning nation. Alexander Hamilton's plan to assume state debts unified the country's finances and strengthened federal authority. When Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury in 1789, he faced a fragmented financial landscape where individual states had accumulated their own war debts, some much larger than others. His solution was bold. The federal government would take over, or assume, these state debts and combine them into a single national obligation. This idea was controversial because states like Virginia had already paid off much of their debt and didn't want to subsidize others. But Hamilton understood something deeper. By centralizing the debt, he could bind the states together financially and tie wealthy creditors' interests directly to the success of the federal government. If investors believed the national government would reliably repay its debts, they would support its stability. After intense political negotiation, including the famous Compromise of 1790 that placed the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Congress approved the plan. The result was a more unified financial system where the federal government became the primary borrower and economic authority. This move didn't just solve a debt problem. It created a powerful incentive structure that aligned private wealth with national stability, strengthening the young republic's foundation. The creation of the first Bank of the United States established a national financial institution to manage debt and stabilize currency. In the early 1790s, even after consolidating debt, the United States still lacked a reliable mechanism to manage its finances and regulate money. Different states issued their own currencies, and there was no consistent system for collecting taxes or making payments. Alexander Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank modeled partly on the Bank of England, which would hold government deposits, issue a stable national currency, and facilitate credit. Chartered in 1791, the first Bank of the United States became a central hub for the nation's financial operations. It allowed the government to collect taxes more efficiently and make payments in a uniform currency, which increased confidence among both domestic and foreign investors. However, the bank also sparked intense political debate. Figures like Thomas Jefferson argued that it gave too much power to the federal government and favored wealthy elites. Despite the controversy, the bank played a crucial role in stabilizing the economy and managing the country's war debt. It demonstrated that a centralized financial institution could bring order to a fragmented system, setting a precedent for future institutions like the Federal Reserve. Funding the national debt at full value restored American credit and attracted both domestic and foreign investment. One of Alexander Hamilton's most controversial decisions was to repay government bonds at their full face value, even though many original holders had sold them at steep discounts to speculators. Critics argued this rewarded opportunists, but Hamilton had a strategic reason. He wanted to establish the United States as a nation that honored its financial commitments without exception. By doing so, he sent a clear signal to the world that U.S. government debt was reliable and trustworthy. This policy transformed American credit almost overnight. Investors, both at home and abroad, became more willing to lend money to the U.S., knowing they would be repaid in full. This influx of confidence helped stabilize the economy and made it easier for the government to finance future projects and emergencies. It also created an active market for government bonds, linking the success of the nation to the financial interests of investors. In effect, the decision to fund the debt at full value turned a post-war liability into a powerful financial asset, anchoring the country's emerging economic system in credibility and trust. Excise taxes like the whiskey tax revealed the tension between federal financial power and local resistance in the new system. To pay off the national debt and fund government operations, the federal government needed reliable revenue, and one of its first major measures was an excise tax on distilled spirits, introduced in 1791. For many frontier farmers, especially in western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a form of currency and a practical way to transport and sell surplus grain. The tax felt like a direct attack on their livelihood and a symbol of distant federal authority imposing burdens without understanding local realities. Resistance quickly escalated into what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion, where protesters intimidated tax collectors and challenged federal enforcement. President George Washington responded by mobilizing a militia force to suppress the uprising, demonstrating that the new government had both the will and the ability to enforce its financial policies. This moment was critical because it showed that the federal system created to manage war debt was not just theoretical, it had real power over citizens' lives. The rebellion exposed ongoing tensions between centralized authority and local autonomy, but it also confirmed that the United States was committed to maintaining a functioning financial system, even in the face of resistance.